Hey everybody, you don't know this, but this is actually like take three of me trying to record this, and I'm just going to give it a go this time, and whatever comes out is going to come out. And I'm going to just ask you to hear my heart on this. It's some stuff I've been considering, some things in my own heart that I've been contemplating and seeking God's guidance on, particularly on what it means to be a Jesus follower and what it means to be a Christ follower in the world that we're currently living in. Because if you look at our current landscape, you're seeing everything from a global pandemic called COVID to seeing social unrest and social injustice, on top of the fact that here in the United States, this is an election year. And when you look at all of that and you consider all of that, it would seem to me that the world has grown increasingly partisan. And then when you throw in the mix being a Jesus follower, being a Christian, it gets increasingly hard to navigate all of that in such a partisan world. Because we are in a diverse society. Even when you think in the context of our church, we are an incredibly diverse church, a diverse family. But what that means, that diversity means that when it comes to a particular topic or even political agenda, we've got people that stand on either side of the aisle. And don't always see eye to eye on things. And then as well, it becomes increasingly difficult because if we're all honest as individuals, we all have our own ingrained political thoughts, ideologies, and agendas that we would subscribe ourselves to. And so in this kind of partisan season of the world where everything around us is going on, my prayer has been, God, will you put your finger on stuff in my own heart? Will you show me some of those add-ons that I have added to my Christianity? And show me where to go. Show me how to move. Show me what to believe. Show me what it really means to follow you. And as I've been considering this and contemplating this, I've actually turned my attention to the early church. As you know, I'm passionate about the scriptures. I'm passionate about history. And I look back at the early church and some of their pillars and some of their practices, the things that they believed and the things that they embodied. And as I began to study, I began to realize there's actually a lot that they did that we can emulate now in our world that can help us. And I want to just give you 5 things that I've learned about the early church, five pillars, 5 practices that the early church applied in their lives and what it means perhaps for us even today. Here's the first one. The early church was pro-life. They believed in the sacredness of life, especially the life of the unborn. In Roman rule in the first century, Roman culture and Roman society, abortion is something that was practiced regularly. As well, in Roman society, a father of a household, if they didn't want a child, they literally could leave the child out on the street and essentially leave the child to fend for itself and ultimately die. But Christians were recorded as being notorious for taking those children into their homes and adopting them and giving those children a family and a place to live. So the early church, one of their practices, one of their pillars was that they were pro-life. Here's another fact about the early church is that they believed in the institution of marriage, that marriage was between one man and one woman. And they actually looked to God as the source of that and the creator of that model. They would go back to the Garden of Eden and they would look at Adam and Eve, how God created man and woman and brought them together. And I will say this on the topic of the institution of marriage, the early church is not recorded as getting picket signs and protesting those in society that didn't believe as they did. And the truth is, the majority of society didn't believe as they did, yet they practiced and they used as a pillar of life the institution of marriage being between one man and one woman. Here's another pillar and practice of the early church, the New Testament church, is that they actually regarded women as equal. This made them stand out in the society in which they lived. Women were not created equal as far as society saw that, but the church, believers, followers of Jesus, saw women as equal and treated them as such. You even think about when Jesus is resurrected from the dead. Who's the first person that finds out? Who's the first person that is trusted with the message to tell the world that Jesus is resurrected? It was Mary. It was a woman. And Christianity has always elevated the standing of women. And that's the early church. They practiced that. They participated in that. Another pillar, another practice of the early church was that they took care of the poor. This was huge in the life of the early church. They helped those that couldn't help themselves, that they helped those that had no ability to return the favor. The early church is actually historically noted for its generosity. You look at the scriptures, the book of Acts, it says nothing that they had, they considered to be their own. History even tells us that the early church, they built hospitals for the poor. They built clinics for the lepers. I think that's amazing. And then here's the fifth pillar. It speaks very specifically even to where we are today in our culture and in our society. The early church, they were all about race relations and unity amongst the races. The early church believed that there was now no longer Greek or Jew, male or female, this whole thing, but we were one in Christ. The early church, they were for helping those that were oppressed because of their skin color or because of where they came from. The early church believed that God and Jesus shared one nature. We still believe that to this day. And the early church believed that all humans were created in God's image. That means that regardless of their ethnicity or their skin color or where they came from, their class or their gender, we all stand before God as the human race. And therefore we are required to take care of God's children, whether they are Christians or not. So I look at these pillars, these practices of the early church, and it's funny as we look at them, a couple of them these days through our contextual lens, through our society's lens, we look at these pillars, a couple of them go, ooh, that's a conservative agenda. That is a conservative talking point. And then we look at a couple of the other pillars and we go, oh, that's a very liberal agenda. That's a very liberal talking point. And here's what I want you to consider. I want you to think with me. Calling Jesus Lord means that he actually gets priority in our lives over every ingrained political stance or point of view that we might have. Right, I said this on the weekend message. Jesus either has all authority in our life or he has no authority in our life. That's why he says, count the cost before following me, because your life is no longer your own, and we are required to emulate Jesus. And hear me, Jesus wasn't a Democrat. And guess what? He wasn't a Republican either. You study the life of Jesus, you look through the scriptures, you even read historical references of Jesus. When it came to social justice issues, many thought he was too liberal. Right? It seems like the people that Jesus was always making upset was the religious folk and the conservative folk. When it came to social justice issues, Jesus was deemed to be too liberal. But then when it came to morality and moral issues, his contemporaries looked at him and thought, oh, he's way too conservative for me. So what does this mean? It means that being a Christian, and by the way, that word Christian means little Christ. Being a little Christ means that my life actually is countercultural. It means that we swim upstream in a downstream world. It means this, that no longer do we get to neatly fit into one of two political boxes. No. And when you look at the example that the early church set for us, they didn't engage in these pillars or in these practices. They didn't engage in these behaviors because they were motivated by a political or by a social agenda. They weren't saying, I'm going to be pro-life because this is my political stance, or I'm going to be pro-race equality because this is my social agenda. No. They engaged in these behaviors because they believed that conduct was actually the direct expression and application of the gospel. You see, for the early church, this wasn't about politics. It was about people. And the same is true today. Listen, if we follow Jesus, we don't get to fit into one of two boxes. No. This thing becomes about people. And obviously, we're not the early church. We're living in the last days. We live in a different time period. We live in a different context. We're not under Roman rule. Not everything translates straight across. But we have to ask the question, where do we go from here? So we may not have the ability to be the early church and live in their world, but their perspectives and their principles can be enormously helpful for us as we continue to live, learn to live as strangers in a strange land. Make no mistake, this earth is not our home. As believers, we are just sojourners. We're passing through. We're awaiting the day where we will stand before our King. Right now, we live in a kingdom where the King is not present, but there's a day coming soon and very soon. The King is going to return, and he's going to set everything right. But right now, we're strangers living in a strange land. And as we look at the early church, as we see their example, it compels us to take a close look at our own convictions and to decide whether or not we're committed to bringing our beliefs and behaviors in line and to put our faith in action in a way that truly makes an impact in the world. Listen, there's three things that God requires of us. Three things God requires of everyone that calls Jesus Lord. That we do what's right, that we do justly, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly before God. That we do justly. Not just talk about justice, but that we practice, we do, and we act justly. That we love mercy. I love that the scripture says mercy triumphs over judgment. And that we walk humbly before God. You see, it's humility that gives us a foothold when we approach God in prayer. And if we can approach God humbly, what that does, it translates into our life where we can approach each other in humility. And right now, with the current temperature of our world, humility is lacking. We need to be humble with each other and come and say, hey, help me understand this. I want to walk in love. I want to put my arm around you. And when you feel uneasy or unsteady, I want to stabilize you. And when I feel unsteady, I want you to stabilize me. We're going to link arms and pursue Jesus together. Listen, as Christians, we don't get to fit into one of two boxes. What we do get to do is do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. Hey, a couple Wednesdays ago, we as a church took our first step in this really important conversation about social justice, in this really important conversation about race relations in the church and who we are and who we're going to be. And during that conversation, I let you know that that was going to be the first conversation of many, the first step of more to come. And I just want you to know, we've been working hard as a church, as a leadership team, trying to figure out what our next steps are going to be. And I want to let you know where we're at on that. Coming up Wednesday nights in July, so just a couple of weeks from now, we're going to do a teaching series called A City on a Hill. And we're going to do this teaching series around race relations in the church and who we are and who God's called us to be. He's called us to be a city on a hill, which means we get to be a city within a city and paint an alternate picture to the surrounding cities as to what it can look like when Jesus is King and when Jesus is Lord. And I'm really excited about that teaching series. And one of the Wednesday nights, and then we're going to do another panel, another conversation around race relations in the church and who we are. And then I also want you to know that between now and when we start that series in July, we are working hard to get another live event, another live conversation to take place around race relations. Listen, this is something that's really important to us. It's something that we need to imbibe and that we need to do well. Because we want to be Christians. We want to be little Christ. And we want to bring a living Jesus to a dying world. Again, I'm not asking you to agree with everything I've said here, but I do want you to think with me. And I do want you to agree on the fact that this is not political. This is not about politics. This is about people. We've been called to love people. God created people. God died for people. And people need to be at our forefront. We need to love them. We need to include them. And we need to have honest conversation about pursuing Jesus together. Church, we are a city on a hill. We are light in darkness. So let's do justly. Let's love mercy. And let's walk humbly before God together. Love you, church, and I'll talk to you soon.